Okay, welcome to our third week of talking about urban ecology. This will be the last week that we're talking about this urban ecology stuff. Sorry, my cat, I don't know if you heard that on your end, but my cat just meowed right into the speaker. um, anyway, hopefully you all had a good break. I guess it wasn't a real break, but I gave you a break for this course last week. So hopefully that was helpful and allowed you to get caught up on some stuff. I'm not sure why the university thought it was a good idea to not give you guys a break, so I decided to do it anyway. But okay, so let's just get into this stuff. Um, I want to start off talking about. So I had you guys look up some case studies, and I think we're just going to go through two different case studies here, so you can get sort of a feel for some of these types of urban ecological issues and why they're interdisciplinary in nature. So for the first one, I want to talk about London, going back to 1854, and if you've ever taken a geography course, then you've probably heard this story before. It's about the cholera outbreak, but I want to talk about it from an urban ecology perspective and how they were able to pull different types of information to solve this issue. So um, in London in 1854, there were about 2.5 million people, and there were about 432 people per acre, which is pretty dense. If you want to compare that to roughly present day Manhattan has about 100 people per acre. There were nothing that we could consider to be municipal water regulations that would reflect anything that we have right now. And so they didn't really sanitation was just not really something that we had that in any or they had in any recognizable way, and they had a limited understanding of disease causes and disease spread, which is relevant to right now, unfortunately. But there were these two, and we'll come back to this in a second, but there were these two sort of opposing ideas. There's contagion theory and miasma theory. And contagion theory was probably closer to something that we might think of as, our current understanding of how diseases occur. Miasma theory was more of the prevailing thought, but turned out to be incorrect. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit here. Um, but what happened was a cholera outbreak in 1854, and cholera wasn't uncommon, but this was a particularly bad outbreak that occurred in the Golden Square neighborhood of London. And if you're not familiar with the geography of London. So here's the Golden Square neighborhood, and you can see some other landmarks around the city that we've talked about. So we talked about Regent's Park a little bit, if you remember back to early when we talked about sort of the history of urban forestry. I think we maybe even talked about Hyde Park as well. But here you can see the Golden Square neighborhood, so that's where that outbreak occurred. And it was a pretty bad outbreak. Well, cholera itself. So this was a bad outbreak, but cholera itself was a pretty nasty disease, and there was a pretty large contaminated source here, and so some people died within 2 hours of being infected. So cholera is just particularly deadly disease, and this was no different. This outbreak was no different in the sense that there's just not much that you can do, especially not then, for this. So you were just kind of left to whatever natural sort of whether your body can fight it off and withstand the disease or not, was pretty much what they had. But they also had a limited understanding of diseases in general, which played a role in how well they could prevent these sorts of things and sort of stop the spread of it. So coming back to these two opposing ideas, contagion, well, let me start with miasma theory actually. So miasma theory was this outdated idea that it was sort of a combination of um, dirty areas and impoverished areas were the sources of disease, and that areas where people were poor, didn't have a lot of money, couldn't afford nice things, couldn't afford to take care of their home and stuff because they were poor and didn't know if they were gonna be able to afford dinner, let alone the other sort of basic sorts of things that you would want to do. Um, that sort of condition was the cause of a disease. And so it was something that sort of toxified the air. And that if you went to these sorts of areas, if you went to a neighborhood that had, a lot of poverty and people living in conditions that aren't great, um, and you breathe that air, then you would somehow just get sick, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, there's sort of some sanitation stuff wrapped up in here, and obviously that could play a role. But this was also about the morality of people. Like they thought people who were poor or maybe had mental health issues or substance abuse issues, whatever it was, they thought these people lacked some moral character that made them bad people, and this sort of led to some toxification of the air that could cause you to get sick, which is obviously pretty ridiculous, and obviously not at all how disease works. Um, but that was sort of the prevailing theory, and this was 150 or 170-ish years ago, and so that's what they thought. But there was another school of thought called contagion theory, where this was more aligned with what we might think of um, now in terms of disease studies. And they didn't really have an understanding of microbes and bacteria and viruses then, but these people thought that specific diseases had specific, specific symptoms, and they had transmission vectors, and they spread in specific ways that were individual or specific to that individual disease. And so, the common flu is not going to spread in the same way that a cholera outbreak would. Even though they may not have understood the mechanisms, contagion theory was more about each individual contagion probably had its own vector and mode of transport of spreading, and that was more in line with what we might think of today, even though they didn't fully understand it. And so there were these two guys. You have probably heard of at least Jon Snow, and this is not the King of the North, just a regular dude named Jon Snow hanging out. And again, you've probably heard of him if you've taken a geography class before. But there's also Henry Whitehead. So Jon Snow was like a surgeon and someone who we might think of as like a public health um, scientist, sort of, if there was such a thing back then. Henry Whitehead was a religious cleric, some sort of religious figure. I don't know exactly what his title was. So you might think that these two were an unlikely pair, and I suppose they were, but Henry Whitehead was involved in a lot of work that you might consider to be like charitable work, sort of like his he was affiliated with a church around the Golden Square neighborhood that did a lot of like taking care of people when they got sick, bringing them food or clothes or blankets or whatever they may have needed. So while he wasn't a scientist, he had a lot of on the ground experience. Like he was collecting data. Even if he wasn't collecting it himself, he had knowledge of who had the disease, and who didn't have the disease, and what their habits were, and where they traveled to and what they did. So he had all this information that is really important to understanding the patterns of the disease. And eventually these two got together and started talking. And I don't know the story there about how that happened, but it did happen. And they had some observations. The two of them started talking and realized that there were a couple of things that didn't really make sense if miasma theory was correct, which is what most people believed. And so their observations were that wealthy, moral people, and again, this is some outdated ideas of the fact that whether you're poor or have resources makes you some sort of moral person. And I guess there's still some thoughts on that today. But but there was some of that tied up. And so, but these wealthy people who then were considered to be moral and upstanding good people were getting sick too. And they shouldn't be if miasma theory was correct. And not all impoverished people were getting sick. So people who lived in these neighborhoods that didn't have as much wealth, not everyone was getting sick there. And so if there was something fundamental about the air in the neighborhood, then shouldn't everyone be getting sick if miasma theory was correct? So these were these two observations that led John Snow and Henry Whitehead to think, maybe there's something else going on here. So they wanted to understand better the source and what was going on, and so they needed some data, and they needed data from different sources. They needed data about where people were getting their drinking water, so public infrastructure data. They needed drainage patterns, which is topography and geographic data, and they needed death records, which is what we think of as public health data now, and there wasn't as much of it then, but there were death records, and they needed a geographic way to look at those. And they collected as much of this type of data as they could, and they put it all together, and it led to this map, which you have probably seen at some point. If you've taken a geography class, it's one of the most famous maps, or any sort of public health map. John Snow was able to take all of this data and create this map where he mapped out the occurrences of cholera outbreaks in the Golden Square neighborhood and found a concentration of them around this area in here, and was able to figure out what was going on there. And so if you don't know, there was a water pump that was located there, and it did turn out to be the source of the contamination, but there were some ways, it wasn't immediately clear even after they made that map exactly what was going on. Even though they had an idea, they wanted to prove it, or at least provide evidence for it. And so they were able to use the data to sort of perform these experiments where they could look at people who breathed the air in the neighborhood but did not drink from the pump. And so these people should have gotten sick if miasma theory was correct, because miasma theory said, there was something toxic about the air, and people who breathed the air but did not drink from the pump should get sick, but they did not. Those people did not actually get sick because the pump was the source of the outbreak and they weren't drinking from the pump. Also, people who drank from the pump but didn't breathe the air should not have gotten sick if miasma theory was correct, but they did. These people did get sick because they drank from the pump, which was the source of the contamination. And so these two things, pretty solid evidence against miasma theory and in favor of the contagion explanation or model for cholera, and ultimately that the pump was the source of the contamination. And it was. They were able to track it to a specific property where a family lived, where there was this. So here's the main sewer line that feeds into the main Broad Street pump. And they had this cesspool, basically this like area in their yard where they were just sort of throwing stuff because, they probably didn't have, there probably wasn't any sort of public garbage pickup or removal or anything. So, people had to just get rid of their trash however they could, and a lot of people just kind of threw it somewhere. And so these people were throwing stuff, and there was a contaminated source. I think it ended up, they thought it was like a diaper from a baby or something that they threw into this cesspool out in front of their yard. And their main water or sewer line went right through here, which normally, if there were no leaks, wouldn't have been a major issue. Not ideal, but not a major issue. But there was a leak right here, and that allowed that contaminated water source to get into the main sewer line, and that got into the main Broad Street pump, and that caused the source of the contamination. And they shut off the Broad Street pump, and the cholera outbreak stopped. So they ended up solving it. One interesting part is that some historians actually think that the removal of the pump didn't have any effects. So though they removed the handle, from the pump for the right reasons, it didn't have an effect because the original source of the contamination had ended and the water was no longer a risk. So basically, the cholera outbreak, the water, new water had been flushed into the pump and basically removed the contaminated water from it. So the contamination had ended. So even though they were right that it came from the pump, they were probably a little too late in removing the pump to prevent the majority of the spread. Now they probably did still prevent some cases of cholera, so that's a good thing. But most of the outbreak was probably done by the time they implemented this, which has some relevance to how things are being handled right now with our current public health issues. But anyway, so that's that story, and I wanted to mention it because of a number of things. First of all, the response to this, this is sort of the first public health sort of study, and so it caused a lot of changes in public administration, especially in London. The public administration of water supply was created, regulations for living conditions were created, public health data was viewed as, obviously you could see how important public health data was in solving this, and so that was something that was sort of created, where the collection of public health data as an asset, a public asset, improved access to safe drinking water. It advanced the field of epidemiology, and it was really a catalyst for these types of changes in other cities globally, as people learned from this, and we're still learning from it today. But I wanted to mention it. It may not be immediately obvious, and maybe this isn't super relevant to urban forestry, but it is an urban ecological issue, and is, I think, really obvious to see why this is an interdisciplinary issue when you look at all the different types of data and different domains of data that were required to solve this issue, and this is just a classic example of urban ecological issues. So I'll end this video there and keep working your way through the module, and for the next video we'll talk about some urban forestry stuff in Baltimore.